Hi there, and welcome to this talk about using Hugo, Azure Storage, and Azure CDN for a cheap and performant website on Azure. My name is Chris Reddington, and I am a cloud solution architect at Microsoft. And one of the things that I like to do in my spare time is I like to go ahead and do blogging, vlogging, and podcasting. And I do all of that through my website, Cloudwithkris.com. You can find me on YouTube, Cloudwithkris, and on Twitter at RedObowen. And we're going to be talking all about how I deploy and manage Cloudwithkris.com using those services that I mentioned a moment earlier there. So let's think for a moment about what we'll be gaining from this session. So first off, we'll help you understand what the static content hosting pattern is from a cloud design pattern perspective. Secondly, we'll then understand the concept of Jamstack and how a static site generator like Hugo relates to the previous pattern that we mentioned. And then finally, how you can go ahead and use those relevant services that we mentioned, like Azure Storage, Azure Static Websites, for example, Azure CDN and Azure DNS to implement this pattern overall. So what is the static content hosting pattern? In a nutshell, it's a way that you can go ahead and host content which is static in nature away from services like underlying servers, which are quite costly, and instead hosting them on some kind of storage service. So for example, in this case, we'll be talking about Azure Storage or potentially static websites, for example. Now, there's a great benefit to this because what that means is whether you're just focusing on images for a website that is dynamic or whether you're focusing on an entire website which is static in nature overall, it allows you to go ahead and minimize the cost because, as we mentioned a bit earlier, you can now go ahead, host these assets in storage, which is typically cheaper than something like running an underlying server or underlying compute. Now, the other benefit is because all of these assets are pre-compiled and pre-built, we can go ahead and easily distribute them across the globe by using something like a content delivery network. And if you're not familiar, a content delivery network is effectively like a global cache. There are points of presence distributed across the globe, and then that cache or that CDN effectively has a back end or an origin. And that origin is protected by this CDN. So what it means is when a user requests that content, if it doesn't exist in the CDN pulls it from the back-end origin so that it's there when future users come to go and get it. But this pattern is not necessarily going to be right in all scenarios. For example, if you've got an environment where you need to have dynamic content, so you need to go ahead and add some additional information to the results before you serve it back to the client, for example. Or perhaps you need to go ahead and use this alongside a compute platform, offloading some of that static content. Now, if you think about that scenario, maybe you've got a big monolithic deployment. Sometimes it can be really hard to pull those pieces apart from each other. So you've got to evaluate, is the reward of having that static content globally accessible, part of that CDN, for example, worth the benefit and the pain and the stress of having to pull those parts away from each other? And that's something that you'll need to evaluate on a case-by-case basis. Now, of course, there are some additional considerations to be made as well. Now, for example, that static content endpoint needs to be accessible over HTTP or HTTPS. So effectively, able to be browsed over the public internet is what we're talking about there. But if there is some content that shouldn't be accessible through that CDN, you can use another pattern called the valet key pattern, which is very well documented over on the Azure Architecture Center if you're interested. And effectively what that means is you have to have a token as part of the header or the URL to go ahead and access that particular piece of content. So you're restricting who can actually go ahead and access that. Now, there are some additional considerations here as well. As we mentioned, we talked about this CDN concept. Now, if I think about cloudwithkris.com, Cloudwithkris is a global website. I have users in the United States. I have users in Europe, for example. I have users all the way in Australia as well. So for me, as a host of that platform, I need to go ahead and make sure all of my users across the globe get a great experience. So if I had a storage account in Europe, for example, I don't want my American and my Australian audiences to lose out because of the fact of the speed of light and latency. Also, if I get some content released that actually is very popular, I don't want my back-end storage accounts to be overwhelmed and overloaded. It's those 2 points where a CDN can really help out from an end user experience perspective. And finally, if you are using this pattern alongside other compute platforms, so maybe you're hosting your CSS files, your images, your JavaScript on a CDN, for example, but the core logic of the website is still being run in something like app services, AKS, or whatnot. You also need to think about that overall life cycle from a deployment perspective, how you go and make sure that your content is being released in sync with the updates to the underlying compute. So again, just think about that deployment lifecycle overall. Now this all relates to a very modern approach within software development and web development in particular. And that approach is something called Jamstack. And Jamstack, the JAM at the beginning there, stands for JavaScript, APIs, and markup. And really what we're thinking about there is this concept of building these websites through JavaScript, APIs, and markup. What that means is we can go ahead and pre-render a full website ahead of time instead of having to rely on a dynamic website which will be hosted on expensive compute. They're built using highly optimized static site generators, and some of them we'll explore in a little bit. And then the results, as we've established, can be served from a CDN. You can typically enhance those websites with JavaScript by adding additional functionality, for example, and you can even bring in elements of dynamic nature to those websites by coupling that JavaScript with APIs that you might go ahead and call as a result. So when you combine all of these pieces together, you get some very efficient websites which are very scalable, easy to serve and distribute across a CDN platform. And as an end user, you get a brilliant experience as a result of that. So let's have a think about some of these Jamstack recommended practices here. First off, we've already talked about this, but with static content, you can serve the entire project from a CDN. And what that relies on is the fact that you can go ahead and easily distribute this globally to all of your users. That means your clients are going to see less latency as a result of the application being hosted on points of presence, for example. You may be using modern build tools, things like Babel, PostCSS, and Webpack. What that means is you can build for the web of the future, not the web of the past, and be limited to certain frameworks and certain standards, for example. And a big part of this modern development strategy is using modern build techniques as well. So things like automated pipelines, whether that is GitHub Actions, Azure DevOps pipelines, Jenkins, GitLab, or similar. Being able to use those types of technologies to automate that workflow is an important part of this overall scenario. And atomic deploys, overall, you want to go and make sure that when you deploy the site in full. There's no kind of partial change. It should be an all or nothing. And that's one of the concepts or recommended practices when deploying these Jamstack websites. Now, of course, we mentioned the fact that we rely on a CDN. And because a CDN caches the content that is in the back-end origin, when we release new content, we need to make sure that we purge the CDN of those existing contents so that they won't be served to our end users, and that our end users can get the latest and greatest that is being served from the origin. So we need to invalidate that cache so that once again the latest can be served then to our end users. And ultimately, all of that content, all of that markdown and those templates that render into the final result of a website, they live in Git. So if you go to github.com/chrisreddington/cloudwithkris.com, you will see everything relating to my particular website there. Now, some examples of these static site generators. I'm using Hugo, and Hugo has a brilliant community that surrounds it. They've been very welcoming as I've gone ahead and created some of my own themes, for example, for the platform. But there are others as well. There are other tools like Jekyll, Gatsby, ViewPress, and others, all which achieve similar types of scenarios. So if you're interested in getting started on your journey, I recommend you take a look at one of these static site generators, because they make that job of converting from Markdown into HTML super easy for you. So let's go ahead and take a look at the Cloudwithkris.com architecture. Overall, there's 3 types of components that I use. I use Azure DNS to manage my DNS records, so my www, my podcasts, my staging, and my preview subdomains. I use Azure CDN, and I use the Microsoft flavor of that, and I use that as a front end for my websites, and that is my caching layer. And then the back end is all to do with Azure Storage, and that is where the static assets themselves get published. So the HTML files, the CSS files, the images, the JavaScript and whatnot. Now, of course, I could go ahead and use something like Azure Static Web Apps as well, but when I created Cloudwithkris.com, it was not available. But a lot of the automation functionality, which is absolutely pivotal in this kind of workload, is actually available for you out of the box with static web apps. So if you're starting your journey, I highly encourage you to go and take a look at that service. So let's go ahead now and take a look at this in a bit more hands-on detail. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to create a storage account in one of our existing resource groups. So let's go ahead and navigate over into that resource group here. And we can easily go ahead and create a storage account. So let's go add, and what we'll do is we'll keep a lot of the defaults here, and we'll probably deploy it into North Europe, which is fairly local for us. So let's go ahead and name this resource group. We're going to go ahead and select here North Europe, and we're going to make it locally redundant. But a lot of my production websites that I deploy with static web apps are either geo-redundant or geo-redundant with read access as well. So now we'll go ahead and create that, and it shouldn't take too long to create. It normally takes a few seconds or so here and it gets created. It's one of the fastest resources I find to get spun up in Azure. And what we'll do when we're in the storage account is we'll go ahead and we will turn on a feature called static websites. And static websites effectively allows us to map an index page and an error page based within our blob storage. And that's the magic behind this. That feature gets turned on here. So what we'll see is this option here on the left hand side. Let's go click into it. And we'll enable that feature. For the index, we'll call that index.html. And for the error document, normally I have that in a subfolder of 404, and then it's an index page because of how my content gets generated. So once we save that, we'll navigate back over to our blob container, and notice how we have this $web container here now. If we click into that, you'll see that there are no files there at all at the moment. So let's go navigate over to Storage Explorer and upload some files. So on the left hand side of my screen now, you can see that I have some files that I've pre-compiled ready, as well as Storage Explorer on the right hand side. So all we're going to do is we're going to upload those to the storage account that we just created a few moments ago. So we'll go ahead and drag and drop those across here into the blob container. And there we go. So with that complete, let's navigate back to the Azure portal, and we'll go ahead and look at the properties here of the storage account so we can find the website address. Now you'll notice it's grayed out on my screen, but I'll go ahead, copy that particular detail. We'll open a new tab and go and see the site. And There we go, we have the content running, but what you'll see is there's some rendering issues here, and that's just because I took an artifact from my actual production website, so it's all pointing to my main www address, so Cause is not allowing some of those pieces to be shown there. But this gives you an idea of how simple and easy it is to actually go and spin up and get content onto a static website in Azure Storage. Now, of course, we'd go and do that using some CI or CD process, and I do have a separate session here at the Cloud Lunch and Learn focusing all about that. But there's one other thing that I want to show you here in terms of this pattern, and that's the CDN aspect. Now remember that we mentioned a CDN will typically front that storage account. Now all we need to do inside of a CDN profile is create a CDN endpoint. I happen to be using the Microsoft CDN here, but there are a couple of other flavors as well that you can get, Akamai and Verizon. And I'm just going to give this endpoint a name. We're going to point to an origin for a storage static website, and we're going to go ahead and select that storage account from earlier. And that's as simple as it is. We can go ahead, we can enable custom domains on those endpoints as well if we wish. That's how I've done it for my preview site, my staging site, my www as well. And we can make sure that we have certificates for HTTPS associated as well. Now that might take a little bit of time just to get set up initially, but as you can see, I've got an existing endpoint available here. So what we're going to do is we're just going to navigate into that existing one here and take a look at the contents. And as we go across, what you will see here is I've navigated to the HTTP endpoint. My backend storage account doesn't support HTTP, only HTTPS. So I need to force the HTTPS endpoint there. And there we go. We can see that the content is all rendering as expected, and I can go and browse through that website if I wish. But there's one additional service that we could go and take a look at and consider here, and that is Azure Static Websites. So we're going to go ahead and just have a quick look at the creation experience here. Now, when you create one of these static websites, you have to go and select a resource group, provide a name for that static website and a region which you're going to deploy into. Currently, the only SKU that you have is free because the service is currently in preview, and you can select deployment details there. One of those options is GitHub. And that's actually how I deploy my static website with GitHub, my instance that I have running here. And I'm currently not using this in production. I'm just trialing this out just to get a flavor and a feel for how this service works. But let's go ahead and take a look at that particular instance that I have deployed. So you'll notice that I have this URL on the right hand side. I can go ahead, copy that, open up a new tab here and view the website once again. And what you will notice is it's exactly the same as what we saw earlier. This static website, very quick in terms of running and operating, and all as we would expect. But there's additional features and functionality. Of course, we've talked about the CI/CD, but notice how my production build comes from master, and I can also have these staging builds as well for other branches in my environment. I can also point to some backend functions if I have those. I've got custom domains here. So I've got a lot of extra functionality, especially when we think of those backend functions, which might be API endpoints that can integrate with my static website. Even things like role management. Maybe I want to go and protect my website by ensuring authentication, whether that is through Azure AD, GitHub, Facebook, Twitter, or Google, for example. So you can see that this service gives us a lot of added benefits on top of what we get with the Blob Storage hosting option. So if you're starting down this path, this is definitely something I would recommend considering. But of course, don't forget to also look at your CDN as well in front of that service. Okay, so how do you go and learn more about static content, static web apps, and these static site generators? Well, number one, given we're talking about Azure, you absolutely have to be aware of Microsoft Learn. And Microsoft Learn is a platform that offers you a set of guided modules, which some of them form into learning paths, and ultimately help you learn towards certain certifications, whether that is role-based certifications or just to expand your knowledge. And you're not just limited to reading material and hands-on practical material. There's also Learn TV, which is a more video and audio based approach for you to go and learn as well. Next up, we have Hugo. And Hugo is one of those static site generators that we mentioned a bit earlier. Hugo is a very welcoming community. There's some great content over on gohugo.io and a very, very welcoming community that is willing to help you get going and learn. So I couldn't recommend Hugo enough. And finally, I have to mention, of course, my own website, Cloudwithkris. This is a topic that I'm incredibly passionate about. The whole static content side of things, being able to deploy using great DevOps principles and easily push your content out there. Please go ahead and take a look at cloudwithkris.com. I'm also on YouTube, Cloudwithkris, and you can also follow me on Twitter at RedObowen. So with that, thank you for listening to this talk as part of the Cloud Lunch and Learn Marathon. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please find the details on the screen of how you can share on to others and evangelize about the Cloud Lunch and Learn Marathon. So thank you for listening in.